Lovely to be with you. I'm speaking from North London. This session is based upon a book that I've got coming out in October. It's a sequel to a book that I wrote called Plugged In a few years ago. I'd like to say it's the second part of a trilogy. I'd like it to be, but I don't know what the third book will be about. But anyway, and it's in the area of how do we connect and confront the culture with the gospel. I've been lecturing in culture, religion and public theology for, 16 years now. My background training is as a theologian, especially looking at Christianity's relationship to other religions. And I suppose that's led me into the whole area of cultural engagement and in what you might call post-Christian, secular, West, however you want to use those demarcations. And what I'd like to present to you is a theological framework for engaging any culture, really, but maybe contextualized especially for what we might call late modern Western culture. So you should have the handout in front of you. Now, if we had more time, I'd love us to have more time. We don't. I'd love to start by just looking at within the sociology of religion over the last 30 or 40 years, lots of discussions on whether we are disenchanted as a culture or whether we are enchanted. And there's big discussions on this. Some of you, I'm sure you will have read some of the work, or you've read some of the summaries of the work of someone like Charles Taylor, and against people like Rodney Stark, where Rodney Stark is quite dismissive of Taylor, saying that we're not disenchanted at all, we're as enchanted as we've ever been. And those discussions go on and back and forth like a game of ping pong. And I find both truth in both of those frameworks, really, and especially as we compare that to the biblical narrative of what you might call a theological anthropology. And so what I want to outline is this framework, or you could call it a morphology, an anatomy of the human, that I do think is quite helpful as an analytical tool for doing cultural engagement. And it's called the magnetic point. So this is, I'm going to try and explain this to you in this session today. So just some theological workings, some theological background, and it's this recognition in the Bible and both Old Testament and New Testament that human beings are those created who both know God and do not know God at the same time. In the cosmic game of hide and seek, we often think that God is hiding and we are the ones who have been looking for him, and we've looked for him everywhere. Yuri Gagarin went up to space, came back down and said, there's no one there. But the Bible tells us very clearly that it's the opposite way round. In the cosmic game of hide and seek, we are the ones hiding. God is not hiding. God has made himself manifest. He has revealed himself in all that has been created. Of course, we see this in Romans 1. Now, what I've been spending a little bit of time doing, both at a popular level and a more academic level, is just trying to work out what's going on in that Romans 1 passage, and especially the bit where Paul says that since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen. Now, I've looked at loads of commentaries here, and to be honest, a lot of the commentators really don't know why Paul is using those particular attributes. Why does he focus on those two attributes, eternal power and divine nature? And this is where I've been influenced, and this whole presentation is influenced by a Dutch Reformed missiologist called J.H. Bavinck, nephew of the famous theologian Herman Bavinck. And I suppose one of my life's work, I suppose, is to try and repristinate or recontextualize Bavinck for the 21st century. And Bavinck says something very interesting here. He says, eternal power has the idea that God has created to human beings that we are dependent upon him. God is the creator, we are created, and it's a sense of dependence that eternal power conveys or reveals. Not only dependence, but divine nature. That God has a nature. We are not relating to God as a something or an it, but there is a personal relationship to whom we are accountable. So dependence and accountability, Bavinck argues, are built into our very image of godness, what it means to be human. We have a sense that we are dependent and accountable before the fall on God. After the fall, well, as we'll see, dependence and accountability still go forward, but not necessarily on the living God of the Bible. And so we're made to relate as God's image bearers. We're made to cultivate the cultural mandate, and I'm sure I don't need to persuade anyone of that important dominion mandate. Probably this whole session is about what that means. What do we do, though? Well, Romans 1 makes it clear. We suppress that truth that God has revealed. We literally hold its head under the water. That's the word for the illustration of suppression there. And we substitute it for all kinds of things, which, of course, the Bible calls idolatry. Now, it still means that we still think we are dependent or accountable, but not necessarily to God. So I could say a lot more about Romans 1, but we see Romans 1, of course, worked out in Acts 17. A city literally submerged in idolatry. That's how it's described. Paul has a paroxysm. He has a violent reaction to the idolatry that he sees. But what does he do? Well, he doesn't say, well, I was only here to meet my friends. They haven't turned up yet. I'm going to hide away in my house. No, he goes out. He does what he always does. He goes to the synagogue. He goes to the public square. They say you are literally, I mean, in our translations, my English translation, it's a babbler, but literally it's a seed picker, one who's picking up ideas that people, they can't kind of fit together. So they haul him up against, in front of the Areopagus. And then Paul uses this very interesting word, or the word that's translated as religious. The problem in understanding what the original meant is that it only appears in this form once in all of the literature, Deus Dei Monsteros. And I've read whole thesis chapters on just this word. And it seems to be a very cleverly chosen word that both piques interest in the readers, but also says something about their religiosity. Here's what one writer says: it's not beyond possibility that Paul cleverly chose this term for the sake of its ambiguity. His readers would wonder whether the bad or good sense was being stressed by Paul, and Paul would be striking a double blow. People cannot eradicate a religious impulse within themselves, as the Athenians demonstrate, and yet this good impulse has been degraded by rebellion against the living and true God, as the Athenians also demonstrate. Although people do not acknowledge it, they are aware of their relation and accountability, Romans 1, to the living and true God who created them, but rather come to terms with him and his wrath against their sin, they pervert the truth, and in this they become ignorant and foolish. So Paul is not simply saying, oh, you Athenians, you're just superstitious. There's no connection of what I'm going to say to you. Neither is he saying, hey, isn't it great that you've got this unknown God? It can't be that, because he's nearly been violently ill because of the idolatry. He's going to call them to repent. And he says, you're ignorant of the thing I'm going to proclaim to you. So it's not an affirmation, but it's not a straightforward denunciation. It's a very clever term. And then, of course, Paul's appeal is the call to repentance. Now, I think that's a very clear exemplar and working out of what Paul has already established, or what is established in Romans chapter 1. Now, let's take that general idea of human beings knowing and not knowing God, running to God and running away from God at the same time, knowing God, being made in God's image, suppressing the truth. And here we come to this idea of the magnetic points. Now, Bavinck was a missionary who worked then in what was called Java, and he lived in his kind of 1895 to 1964. He ended up teaching at the Free University of Amsterdam. He probably wrote the seminal Reform missiology textbook called An Introduction to the Science of Missions. But he talks about these magnetic points. He says, look, I've looked at other religions or other belief systems, and people seem to be asking the same kinds of questions, or the same issues seem to rise up. It's a kind of a comparative religions in a sense. And what I've been trying to do in my work is to try and take that framework and not simply apply it to what we call Hinduism, although I know Hinduism is a Western construct, or Islam, or any of these things, but to apply it to our secular late modern society. So these are 5 scratches or itches that we have to scratch. They're all perspectives on what we might call the one religious consciousness. That is the fact that God has revealed himself to us. We have suppressed the truth, but it has to come out somewhere. It has to come out in the objects of worship that we have in our lives. And so there's 5 of these magnetic points. And so all I'm going to do now for my last 10 minutes is just very briefly go through these magnetic points. And then in groups, I want you to think about how these magnetic points manifest in your own culture and context. So the first one that Bavinck describes is totality. Is there a way to connect? And again, as I go through these are all, I suppose, implications or applications of that Romans 1:18 passage. Dependence and accountability, they all come from that. That's the kind of the clay from which these magnetic points are built or molded. All humans have an innate sense of totality, that they're small cogs in a much bigger machine. It's the idea that we're cosmically interconnected. And with this, we struggle as humans to simultaneously believe that on the one hand, we're small and insignificant, but also that we're significant when we belong. And so we enjoy communal awareness. We crave connection. We feel abandoned after we've experienced it, and we crave for it again and again. Now, in the book that I'm writing, I give all kinds of examples about this, but let me just give one. In 2012, Facebook, and I know that Facebook, my kids don't use Facebook at all, but I presume some of you still know what Facebook is. In 2012, Facebook celebrated its 1 billionth user in 2012. Listen, this was the advert that Facebook put together in 2012. Think about totality. Chairs. Chairs are made so that people can sit down and take a break. Anyone can sit on a chair, and if the chair is large enough, they can sit down together and tell jokes or make up stories or just listen. Chairs are for people, and that is why chairs are like Facebook. Doorbells, airplanes, bridges. These are things people use to get together so they can open up and connect about ideas and music and other things that people share. Dance floors, basketball, a great nation. A great nation is something people build so they can have a place where they belong. The universe, it is vast and dark, and it makes us wonder if we are alone. So maybe the reason we make all of these things is to remind us that we are not. Now, I guarantee Mark Zuckerberg has not read J.H. Bavinck. I may be wrong, but I don't think that's the case. But it's this idea of totality, connection. Why are programs like Who Do You Think You Are trying to trace our roots? Because we want to know that we're part of something bigger. What about conspiracy theory enthusiasts, or people who go to Comic-Con or Pride parades? People who often feel like outsiders, but when they're part of this bigger thing, they know that they are surrounded by others and they gain a sense of identity. What about the avalanche of adverts? I see this on the London tubes for dating agencies, eHarmony, Match.com, Silver Singles, that's one. In the above us only sky world, as John Lennon would have it, romantic relationships often bear the weight that communion with God, the transcendent being, used to bear. People therefore have a stronger desire to consider themselves to have a deeper need for the perfect romantic relationship. So lots more examples I could give, but that's totality. Is there a way to connect? Second, norm. Is there a way to live? People have a vague sense that there are rules to be obeyed. People know and accept that there are moral standards and codes which they must adhere. And there's an appreciation to transcendent norms which apply to all people. Now, it doesn't matter what those norms are. The fact is we have norms. A friend of mine was in their local coffee shop the other day. A lady walked in pushing a buggy, a pram. She walked up to the counter and said, "Are your straws paper or plastic?" Fortunately, the owner said paper, at which the lady said, "I'm so glad I can drink here." To be plastic, vegan, socially aware is a new norm that we feel we need to live up to and obey. Now, of course, social media kind of magnifies that. Today, it's not enough to be virtuous. One needs to be seen to be virtuous. And there's lots more examples I could give. What about clothing? A friend of mine was a goth in their youth, and part of the appeal was being different to the norm. But the other side of it is that everyone has to be different together in the same way. And the goth rules are very different to the rules of the wider culture, but they are there. Now, apparently, really well-established goths can wear baby pink because it's ironic. But if you're not an experienced goth and you wear pink, you'll be shown as not fitting in. The pleasure comes from not conforming to certain societal norms, but you still want to conform to the rules of the subculture because you need to fit in somewhere. The third magnetic point is deliverance. Is there a way out? And these are my own terms for Bavinck's work. There's something not quite right with the world is a common and little disputed notion. There's finitude, brokenness, and wrongdoing. We mourn for a paradise lost and long for deliverance from these evils. While we note that under the sun, troubles do not melt like lemon drops, as Over the Rainbow says, it's that idea that of Sehnsucht, which of course C.S. Lewis and other people talked about, that longing for a paradise lost that can be regained. Of course, the problem is no one can agree on what the problem is from which we need to be delivered, if there's deliverance at all. Sometimes the problem is out there in the world. Sometimes it's other people. Sometimes the problem is inside. There's a book that's going around by a sports psychologist called Steve Peters called The Chimp Paradox, who actually basically says that the problem is in you. There's a part of our brain called the inner chimp that we must save ourselves from our own brain. Interestingly, the impulsive part of our brain is not even you. Of course, we have to always deal with this deliverance from death, and how we deal with death, even in COVID, has been very interesting. I know a lot of pastors who have conversations with people who are just anxious or fearful of sickness and death. A friend of mine had a conversation with a dog walker recently who was struggling to come to terms with the death of a loved one and had dabbled in spiritualist things. When my friend spoke of the hope of the resurrection, this well-read urbanite responded, "But how can we know? If only someone could come back from the other side to tell us for certain." Fourthly, my favorite point, destiny. Is there a way that we control? Although humans know themselves to be active players in the world, there's a nagging feeling that we're also passive participants in somebody else's world. Bavinck has this great expression that people simultaneously believe that they lead their lives and they undergo their lives. Now, I'm sure some of that is temperamental. Do you think you lead, or are you an undergoer? But lots of examples here. The one that I've done a lot of work on, written some articles, is someone who was working in an office where you were not allowed to say the phrase, "the phones are quiet." Because if you said that phrase, something malevolent would make the phones ring. And I thought this was crazy, but then it's everywhere. My son's a policeman. On the radio, you're not allowed to say "it's quiet tonight." You have to use the letter Q, because it's this superstitious idea that something will make the session busy. And there's all kinds of these kinds of ideas that are all over the place. Finally, a higher power. Is there a way above? Or a way beyond, I suppose? People everywhere perceive that behind all realities stands a greater reality. This is where all the other magnetic points converge. The more you push in on these other points. Now, Bavinck talks about it in terms of God, but I think in our context, it's as much this understanding of transcendence. Now, I don't deny that there's been 2,000 years of history since Paul was at the Areopagus. So we have to factor in everything that's happened. So I would include here the idea of secular religious experiences. A friend of mine's dad, who wasn't a Christian, felt something when they visited the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. My favorite example in the UK is something called champing. Some of you may have heard of this. Champing is the idea of churches that have got no one going to them and are derelict, people going to stay and camp in a church. The idea is that you camp in a church and you have some kind of experience of the history of the place. And there was one middle-class mum who was interviewed who wanted her kids to wake up with the lights streaming through the stained glass window because it would give them some kind of experience of the transcendent. And there's all kinds of examples like that. Now, as I close, all of those magnetic points are only kind of unpacking the dependence and accountability that we see in Romans 1. They're in a particular configuration. They can be kind of configured differently for different cultures, but all of them are perspectives on this one religious consciousness, and Bavinck calls them the magnetic points. So having outlined the magnetic points, I want to know, I mean, obviously the answer is going to be Jesus. We know that's going to be the answer. The question is, though, how does the gospel of Christ relate to these magnetic points? And I suppose all of this is part of a theological discipline that's been lost, really, called elenchtics. Comes from the word group in the New Testament, elengo, meaning to unmask or to bring to shame. That's the Holy Spirit's role in John chapter 7, that elengo. It's Titus 1:9, the pastoral role to affirm truth and rebuke error. But this idea of unmasking is really important, and it links to a bigger kind of framework that I've been developing, this notion of subversive fulfilment. That's my kind of bigger theological framework for cultural engagement, subversive fulfilment. Again, please read my book Plugged In for more on that. Very briefly, giving the biblical kind of basis for that. One of the central passages I go to is 1 Corinthians 1. Remember, we preach Christ crucified, but in a way that where the gospel confronts. So the gospel is foolishness to the world's ways of doing things. It's a kind of a big fat no to how the world wants to run. The gospel is always confronting that, but in a way that also fulfills. Remember, Paul outlines two ethnic groups. Jews look for power, signs. Greeks look for wisdom. Jews don't look for wisdom. Greeks don't look for power. But at the end of that passage is Christ is the wisdom of God and the power of God, in a subversive way that those ethnic groups expected, but still there's a connection. So the gospel both connects and confronts at the same time. And that's what Paul is doing in Acts 17. He's wandering around, looks at their objects of worship. What you believe in ignorance, I'm now going to proclaim to you. So that bigger subversive fulfillment idea is really important. And of course, we're not offering simply a philosophy, although in some senses the Christian worldview is a philosophy. We're not even offering a worldview, although the Christian worldview is a worldview. We're offering a person with all the relational nature that comes with that. We offer people Christ. And again, in Plugged In, I've given a little way of how we are to do cultural exegesis using that subversive fulfillment model: enter, explore, expose, evangelize. I've got my students for the last, 15 years writing essays on anything they want to in culture using this particular framework. It's not a magic bullet, but it helps going through the stages, I think, of cultural analysis. Now, let's go back to the magnetic points using this subversive fulfillment idea. Here's what Bavinck says: the gospel of Christ addresses people and rips open their religious consciousness. People want to suppress and push away the gospel in the worst way, just as they have repeatedly done with God. But it can happen that God causes their heart to submit. Then all the engines of resistance are switched off and people listen. Then the King of Glory makes his entrance. The everlasting doors of the understanding are thrown open, and this is what we call the new birth. So what we have to do now, and Bavinck doesn't really develop this, I'm kind of developing it myself, is take each one of those magnetic points: totality, norm, deliverance, destiny, higher power. And how do we show very contextually, at a very specific level, how the gospel both subverts the magnetic point and fulfills it at the same time. So Jesus is the way that we connect. Jesus is the way that we live. Jesus is the deliverance. Jesus is the way we control. Jesus is the higher power. In the book, I tie this, just for the sake of memory, to kind of various I am sayings. I mean, connection, that's a really important point, isn't it? We want to affirm that, yes, we are connected. We do want connection. We are Adam from the earth. But this is where theology is really helpful. Remember, totality says we struggle as human beings to work out, are we insignificant or significant? And we can't kind of get a handle on it. And sometimes we think we're nothing. We're just a kind of speck in the universe. We don't account to anything. At other times we think we're divine. And there's this constant oscillation or kind of flip-flop between the two. Now, how does the Christian worldview help? Well, the doctrine of the image of God completely answers that question. We are images of God. We're not God. Therefore, there's a sense in which, compared to God, we are insignificant. We are creatures, and yet we are images of God. We have amazing significance and worth and dignity, something I was speaking on at the public policy thing yesterday about human dignity. So the doctrine of the image of God blasts through that idea of totality. We are both insignificant and significant from a Christian point of view, or from a human point of view. We want to connect. Yes, that's great, because we are from the earth, but we want to connect to a world that is perishing. Why? But then, of course, in Christian theology, we can talk about what it means to be reborn, crucifying ourselves, crucifying the sinful nature. Not that we lose our individuality, but we're born again. So totality, we can talk about communion with God, and then community, the church. The church is the way that we are supremely meant to see this side of Jesus coming back again, what it means to connect. Often the church isn't that, but it should be. So all I'm saying is here that if we take each one of these magnetic points, we can show very clearly how the Christian worldview both subverts and fulfills each of the magnetic points, and also the illustrations, the contextual illustrations that I hope you were talking about. Let's take another one. Jesus is the way that we live. Jesus says, do not think I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Jesus is not only the savior, he is the standard by which we have norms. And here's an amazing thing, that Jesus should, if we proclaim him rightly, both appeal to conservatives and radicals at the same time. Jesus gives us a moral blueprint, and yet he is against hypocrisy and Phariseeism. Jesus is against cancel culture because we have the concept of forgiveness. So again, the idea here is that Jesus is the norm. He is the way that we live, not in an abstract set of laws, but in his person. Jesus is the way out. He is the resurrection and the life. Jesus is the way of control. Remember what Jesus says to Pilate, you would have no authority over me if it had not been given to you from above. We believe not in a mysterious, malevolent force that makes phones ring or don't ring. We believe that Jesus is our loving heavenly Father. What a great contrast to the idea of an impersonal force or capricious spirits that kind of work. It's not that we deny the supernatural. We don't deny the demonic. We don't deny that there is a realm of spiritual being, but we proclaim that Jesus has mastery over that. And finally, of course, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. He is the way beyond. He is the one who has revealed himself. He is the one who is jumping up and down saying, here I am, in that cosmic game of hide and seek. So again, what I think we need to be doing is not, we know that Jesus is the answer. The question is, using these magnetic points, how can we connect how can we get traction as people are going around on with their lives, looking at their objects of worship? I often say to students, People aren't thinking about worldview and these things. People are just getting on with their lives. But what does Isaiah say in that prophetic satirical bit where the idolater makes their dinner and then uses the fuel and worships it? Isaiah says, no one stops to think. And our job is to try and get people to stop and think, to show the appealingness of Jesus and the appallingness of idolatry. And I would suggest that these magnetic points give us traction from where we can build and show how Jesus is the subversive fulfillment.